I'm Victoria Cosner. I'm a public historian and an author, and today is August 14th, 2024.
Okay, perfect. So today we have Vicki here to talk about her book, Missouri Murderous Matrons. So I just have a couple questions that we can go over. First, what caught your attention about these two cases?
I'm very interested in women's history and women's untold history, and my entire career now is based on untold histories. And I used to work across the street at the first Missouri State Capitol, State Historic Site, and someone came in one day and said, "Have you ever heard of this woman that killed her husbands here?" And I'm like, "No, have you?" And they were looking for Emma Hepperman. And so I started Googling, and if you put in women serial killers, the top 10 always has someone named Bertha in there. And Bertha Gifford is out of Catawissa, Missouri. And I realized they were both killing concurrently, within a couple of 20 years of each other. And there were all these similarities, but as I dug deeper, they weren't connected. And so the chances of that happening, in my opinion, in one place and time was too fantastic not to tell the stories. And no one had told the stories yet. They were all like history articles, but little things. And I found a lot.
Yeah, it's crazy. I've grown up here my entire life, and I had never heard of either of those people. Especially, since we're located, almost, right in the center of both killings.
Yes.
They're going on, so close together, and just, again, no one has told these stories, so it is very great to hear that you have such a good interest in women's history and untold history of the county. That's amazing.
Thank you.
So, while I was reading your book, the last couple of pages, you talk about yourself and about your interest in history. And I saw that you had written that you enjoy, all the secret histories within cemeteries and graveyards.
Yes.
So can you talk about it?
Way back when I was just in high school, my health teacher and my mother took me to a cemetery in Phoenix, and I was with a historian named Marshall Trimble, who's a very famous Arizona historian. And he started taking me around the cemetery, and he was telling me stories, like Shorty the Plumber and the Broadway family, and I was enamored. The entire history of Phoenix opened up to me just by looking at these humans. And this was pre-internet, so I'm dating myself, but you had to go into the books to read it, or you had to go into the cemeteries. My master's degree is in cultural landscapes of cemeteries and how people view them. Everything that I can get my hands on that I put into utilizing cemeteries or doing cemetery restoration. They changed my life, the two, Marshall Trimble and Bunny Aaron. So that's why you can tell an entire town's history, the opinions that they have of other races, disease, just by looking at a cemetery.
And did you use past knowledge of doing research, specifically at graveyards and history of whole towns while writing this book?
Not necessarily while writing this book. That was the earliest parts of my journey. A good example is there's a silver mining town in Arizona. Had a mountain. On the top of the mountain were all the Jones Smith white names type of thing. The next layer down was more ethnic, but still Caucasian. So the Schwartz, the German type of Irish were in the back, because they still didn't like Irish back then. The Italians were the next line down. They didn't like Italians. Hispanics were in the back below the Irish. And the Chinese, who I was researching at that point, because they built the railroads in Arizona, they weren't there, but there was supposed to be a Chinese cemetery. And so I looked, and I found the Chinese cemetery in a wash, which when it rained, it would flood and wash through their cemetery. And that was the racial layout of the town. It was incredible. And so you you can use that to get context to put your people into.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you, there's one of her, Hepperman's husbands died. She killed him. She had him cremated, and his body's still there. That tells a lot about the psychology of the woman that just left her husband and lost and found in a cemetery along, in St. Louis. So death is very telling about communities and everything. It's fascinating.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, I have no words for that.
Sorry. I get that a lot.
No, I feel like history and doing research and any sort of thing, whether it's like serial killers or whether it's like racial biases of communities, like there's so many things that people often ignore as sources.
Yeah.
Such as like, no one would think that the order of which like the cemeteries are set up was a source, but it definitely is.
Yeah.
So I feel like all these little niche research that you've done and all the years you've spent as a historian really like showcase your amazing talent in this book.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm blushing.
So why do you think that female serial killers such as Emma and Bertha are less known?
I don't know. I saw that question of yours, and I think it's some sort of weird American denial that a woman could do that. These are particularly heinous. Poison, and especially arsenic poison, is horrible, horrible way to die. But so then you hear about like Alice Warnier, where she was out of Louisiana. She was the hitchhike killer that they ended up calling her because she was being stopped and then she would kill. People all know Werner. People know about her,
Right.
but they don't know about this. And then when I don't know if probably not. Recently, a paper came out about Elizabeth of Bathory, which was she was a Hungarian princess or duchess that was supposedly bathing in the blood of young women.
Mm-hmm.
They don't think she did it. They think that she was mentally ill, and they use that story to, red journalism her into being kept in a tower forever. And they found documentation on it. So our access now to things besides oral history, we can take all of those histories now and put them together. And so the same with Madame LaLaurie, which we don't think that she did it. They're questioning whether Lizzie Borden did the killing or not. And with good documentation and like splatter analysis. So you only hear about the really sensational ones, but there are a lot more women serial killers than we thought, and it's nice to get them documented, but it's more nice to get their victims documented because, this one woman who's poisoning killed 15 people. That's a lot.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but we all need to look at it more.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I also think that, from the female serial killers that I've learned about, a lot of their killing are not so widespread. It's very domestic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I feel like in those situations, like Bertha, who's taking care of children, in such domestic settings, I think they're often overlooked.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. That could be because Bertha killed almost all of them in that house, and people were just like, "Oh, gastritis again. Oh, gastritis. Hey, that guy died of gastritis." But you take a step back and you're like, "How could you not?" But they didn't want to admit that they had a problem. Mm-hmm. So, and they were all scared of her. But we won't go into that now. Maybe later.
Do you have a preference of who you want to start with, either Emma or Bertha?
I do not. So it's up to you.
Let's start with Emma, just because it's down the list, and I have less questions about her. The biggest question I have is, do you think Frank Lee was actually Emma's second husband, since there's no clear evidence of their marriage?
When I first started, you actually asked a question later on about did I find things out after the publication?
Mm-hmm.
And to my dismay, yes, I did some major things after. I was giving a talk in Washington, Missouri, and they used to have these large format journals of serial killers or horror or that type of thing.
Right.
There's a picture of Frank Lee in there. I didn't know Frank Lee was real or not. We can't find it, and it's probably there, but his name is Frank Lee. It's a very, very common name, and hundreds would come up.
Right.
So I do think that he was involved with her. I don't know if he disappeared because he was involved with her, but the newspaper from the 1940s had Frank Lee standing next to her in a photograph. So, that's why I have a job. History, new stuff comes up, new niches come up, and all kinds of stuff. But so, in the book, we were like, we don't know, we can't find Frank. Well, he was real, and whether they married or not, she could still take his name.
Mm-hmm.
So, she saw herself as a marketable wife. So.
Yeah. I had a really, I don't know, I just had, a hard time reading Emma's story just because it's, how many husbands did she have to go under, or, how many marriages did she have to go into before someone stopped and was like, this is very suspicious,
Well, if you look at her from the mapping point of view, she starts in Steelville, and you can see one or two people in Steelville that died of gastritis.
Right.
That were closely to her. I think Emma was killing people who got in her way. So, out of the husbands, and remember we're talking about a time that they're not communicating, jurisdictions and all that. So you have Steelville, then you have somewhere around Pacific. Then she goes to St. Louis. Then she goes back over to Cuba. I think there might have been not one in between there. Then she comes back to St. Louis. Then she goes to St. Peter's. Then she goes to O'Fallon. So if no one's watching it, there's no one except for her children, who she becomes estranged from for some reason, wouldn't know that she'd married that many people. And they might not have even known, she married Bert, who was here in St. Louis, but he was from Cuba. So that one didn't bother me as much as Bertha, honestly, because Bertha, it was the same house. They were all there. There were 140 people in that, or 170 people in that town. She killed 17 of them. She killed 10% of the population of the town. And they're all like, no, she's the nurse in the... That was the one that fascinated me, because small towns, they talk. Well, once Emma kills in St. Peter's and then O'Fallon, she gets two families that care. That's how she got caught. And plus she was getting sloppy and making mistakes. But, they read the same newspaper. In the St. Charles, I think, Herald it was, but they read the same newspaper. And so once she wasn't moving geographically, she did get caught. So yes, it was a hard reading thing to, it's like, why?
Yeah, it was really interesting. It was really interesting to read, especially later on, how she slowly starts to make mistakes and trip up and just not care.
Yeah.
Why do you think that happened?
That happens with serial killers. They get lost in their lives. They basically lose it. Bundy did the same thing, where suddenly he's beating people with a trunk of wood instead of going through his ruse that had worked for so very long. Her ruse had worked for a very long time, and we didn't know what the ruse was until she tried to kill Tony, and did kill Tony Hepperman. But you get cocky when it works. And then if it doesn't work, because, then you start just disintegrating, basically. So I think that that's why she got so sloppy, and then she was in a hurry. Like, the last two, she made them sign a life insurance within 2 weeks of them getting married, and married them within less than 6 months. So she was trying to... I was also fascinated by Emma because she looks a lot older than she was. And I think that she presented herself as matronly because her MO was to put an ad in the paper to be a maid, a housekeeper for folks. So she was tricky along the way. She was pretty smart. She never did confess to any of them. So, could have been wrong.
Why do you think none of, like, her previous husbands had ever been, like, their bodies had ever been autopsied? Like, it was just the last two. Do you think it was because of, like, how strong, like, her, like, focus was and she wasn't making mistakes?
I think that, especially at this time period, they wanted to give the strongest case that they could get. And Aloysius and Tony were a strong case. On top of that, the one before Aloysius was the one that was cremated. Before that, you're in Cuba, which is a different jurisdiction. So, arsenic doesn't leave a body. It actually stays in. That's why they could pull it out and say she had however many grains in his stomach. So I think that's why they didn't autopsy them. I mean, they didn't even know where Frank went. The one that was Bremser.
Yeah.
So they didn't know he was sitting at Valhalla, you know, because you don't have access to the death certificates and stuff. So I think that's why. As Tony was just, I mean, Aloysius was current. It was literally only like 2 or 3 months between the two kills. She'd accelerated her pace of killing to that. And funny or not funny enough, there are kids that watch the exhumation outside of the St. Peter's school windows as they dug up Mr. Schneider and still remember it. Speaking of oral histories, no one's done any with them on the fact that they watched a neighbor of theirs that was killed by a serial killer get dug up. So, yeah. You should take it.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you, like, wish you would have talked about in, like, an Emma section of the book?
The day after this book was published, her death certificate was released. I was mad. But the good thing about it is, I found out where she went after she was released from prison. I found out why she was released from prison. Because why would they, she was probably in her 70s-ish, maybe late 60s. Why? Why would they let someone, they said she wasn't a burden to society anymore. But she was killing methodically, and I don't think they changed. However, if you read the histories of the mental institutions in Missouri, they had an overcrowding problem. And so they took out the least dangerous ones in the insane asylum. The Fulton one had the less aggressive prisoners, I think is how they, not quite as dangerous as the Farmington ones, which is where Bertha was. And so she gets released and she disappears, and that made me angry because I don't think people disappear that easy. She ended up they put her in a halfway house up in Kirksville. She died very quickly, like 2 months after being released. They brought her body down and they buried her in Fulton, and I know where she's buried because of the death certificate that was. So had we waited 2 months, we would have had the full story of Emma. And it's not marked. And that's one thing that I'm finding is serial killers often aren't marked, especially if they're community members. And I'm not sure why. I mean, there's the option that people would dig them up, because they were angry. They're embarrassing. It's embarrassing to have a serial killer in your community. It is. Bertha's wasn't marked until her granddaughter marked it, like 30 years later. So it happens fairly obvious. But I went to the cemetery and I couldn't find her because I had a plot, but they don't have the markings. And so I found the maintenance guys. And I'm like, you guys have a serial killer buried here. And they're like, we do? And I said, yes. And they looked her up for me. We marched over there. And I'm taking pictures of an empty plot, you know. And then I gave them one of the books as a thanks. And I went on my merry way. And they're like, we have a serial killer. But that's where the institution, the asylum, is burying their dead. Mm-hmm. So I had an idea she was there, but couldn't document it. So I got the death certificate. So that's one of the things that I wish I'd gone to. I also wish I could have found Frank Lee. And I wish I could have done something with Mr. Bresner's remains. He's still there in Lost and Found. They can't release it to a non-family member. And that's the reason why he was such a good victim, is he didn't have any family. So he's still there. I wish that we could at least get him put in, but they won't allow that. Maybe someday. So I also would have liked to have gotten her evaluations. Did you know that HIPAA covers people who are alive and dead in perpetuity backwards? So Bertha and Emma died before HIPAA. I cannot access their records, but we'll talk about Bertha in just a second. So despite the fact that they did not exist when HIPAA came in, we still can't access that, which is actually, this is one of my high horse things. The study of mental illness and how people were treated with mental illness has basically been taken off the table for us because we can't access. We only have oral histories. And you have an oral history of someone who might have had a mental illness, their family who was embarrassed that they had it, you know what I mean? And so this one disease doesn't have, this one law doesn't have a grandfather clause or something. I don't know. It was very upsetting. But anyway.
I feel like those would have been like such great sources for the book.
Incredible. They would have been incredible. Because the two women were killing for different reasons, and the psychosis, in our opinion, were two completely different. But we can say what we think all the time. Like you asked why she put Lee as her middle name. As her last name. We can only conjecture. I think it's because she was hiding in plain sight. She was living like 5 blocks from her daughter, and she had a name, and she kept that name. I think she was pretending to be a grieving widow, and that's, she just used the Lee because no one knew where he was. He couldn't be talked to. So, but that's a guess. Complete guess.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to switch over to Bertha now. I have a couple more questions about her.
Don't we all?
Yeah. To start, on page 17, while you were discussing Bertha's victims, you stated many victims, especially the poor and marginalized, were never even autopsied. Obviously, Bertha was working in such small, towns where there wasn't many research. And a lot of these people were poor. That's why they relied on, the community nurse to take care of, sick family members. But even today, do you still think that poor and marginalized victims are not given the resources and attention that they deserve? Or do you think, that's not an issue anymore?
Oh, no, it's still an issue. Especially as a historian. The people who were running hospitals in St. Louis, this is from our second book, they were pulling all of their corpses for medical study. They were running legitimate medical schools. They were pulling them out of the black cemeteries, the Latino cemeteries, the pauper cemeteries, because they wouldn't be missed. They either didn't have family, the family was too poor to maintain the plot, whatever it was that made them disappear in the community. And so we could not replicate the people that he dug up because there's no records. A lot of times in paupers' graves, they would put them in a pit grave.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have 17 people in a grave that died on the same day for whatever reason. The disenfranchised victims, prostitutes, all the, they're easy victims, unfortunately, and there's not a lot of proof about anything. Like, archaeology opens up, like, we found out that there were houses of prostitution in a particular neighborhood in St. Louis that hadn't previously been documented because the women were in the census listed as seamstresses.
Mm-hmm.
There were 20 of them, and they were all about 21, 22, and when we dug in the area, we found porcelain. Is that what 20 seamstresses have? When we start digging, and that's how you start the digging, but it's the material culture is not there. I think that there's a very serious aspect of the community, and now I was talking to some kids who are homeless, like they were, they're staying at a facility, and I'm like, where do you tell your story? And they're like, we don't have a story. And I'm like, but you do have a story, and where would you tell it? And they're like, why would anyone? I'm like, let's not talk about the why, the where. It's online, Snapchat. It goes away. We're never going to see it. So you have like a whole new generation of different type of disenfranchised people that we're going to lose to history. So you have to depend on the cemeteries and the death certificates to see who lived, and then you can see how they died and work your way backwards. But way too long of an answer for what you asked, but yes, I think it's always a problem. Winners tell history. So, got to look at everybody else.
Yeah. Bertha's case was especially interesting because of the number of victims that she had. So she was able to commit so many murders, partially because of the wide access to people she had, since she was considered like the nurse within the community. But the person that was always with her, that stayed by herself or by her side throughout all of this, was her husband, but he was never one of her victims.
Correct.
Why do you think that is?
He never got in her way. When we initially started this, her granddaughter, whose name is Kay, wrote this fantastic book about her grandmother and was saying that she wasn't a serial killer. And the way that she spoke about it was that she didn't get a fair trial because it was white men on the jury, not a fair trial, and I agree with that. Most people want to say it was because she was insane. And if you're insane, you don't have to have a method. And she obviously had a mental illness, but everybody who died got in her way. As we started laying out the charts and the family histories, there's one family that she killed like 7 people in it. She wiped a family off the face of the earth, and they'd had some sort of war with her, a turf war, as neighbors.
Yeah.
Her last one, Brinley, he owed them money, and he thought that they owed him money and accused him of that. The next time he came by in his cups, as they referred to it, he died. And that's something that Kay never really looked at. And the more that we pulled the connections, the more we saw you have a problem here and then someone dies. You have the schoolhouse not being nice enough for her granddaughter to go to. She goes to the school board and they say, no, we can't afford it. And then the schoolhouse burns. You have people at a picnic that probably dissed her potato salad or something, biscuits were her thing.
Okay.
But, and then a whole bunch of them are food poisoned, and so it goes back to how many coincidences can you have in a community? Well, when you start looking at why they had a run-in with her, she had a grudge, and oftentimes the grudge would go on for years. Eugene never denied her anything. He adored her, and he never spoke out in the court. He never spoke out after she was buried and dead. He always supported her, and I think that's why he survived it, because she killed her first husband because she met Eugene, so he was in the way. And then there was a stepson that was too nosy, so then he goes away. So I think that's why Eugene made it. He kept his mouth shut and he supported her. And it sounds oversimplified, but again, how do you have, she obviously was schizophrenic, and when you're a historian and people tell you can't get things like medical records or something, sometimes things show up on your doorstep. Like Bertha's medical records, which I got to see because they came in an unmarked envelope to my house. She was paranoid schizophrenic, and that was the diagnosis, and she was not releasable into they were never going to give her parole. They let her work in the kitchen, which I always was like, okay. But she was very, very ill, so the rhyme or reason gets really cloudy at that point, that when you are that mentally ill, what's your motive? Well, your motive is you don't know because something annoys you, and that's the end of it. So again, way too long of an answer, but it was fascinating, the psychology of how she was killing, and the psychology of the denial of the people who saw that she was killing, like the medical examiner or Eugene, because he was there, is fascinating. Why they didn't speak up. And she killed, I think, 15 people in Catawissa and 2 outside of Catawissa. So, yeah. Did I answer your question?
I think you did.
Okay.
Yes, you did. Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the whole, denial aspect of everything. Because, so you have people in her community that start taking her medical advice where she had never previously said that she had any medical treatment.
Correct.
And she had she had people in the community who would bring child after child after child to her after they had all passed away of mysterious illnesses.
Gastritis.
Yeah. And then you have the actual doctor that would come in and sign off on all these death certificates. And I mean, there was one case where he did bring in a second opinion, but even then there was no one there that was maybe this is suspicious until it was 15 victims in.
Yeah. Well, and we spoke briefly, I think, before we turned on the cameras, that there are heroes in both of these stories. And the heroes were family members who said, wait a minute, people in the town didn't start suspecting until the Schammel boys, which I think were 12 and 13, not years old, but number 12 and number 13 in there. And that's when the whispers start. Well, there was one family that had already lost 5 kids, and the mother at that point, why? Well, so you go to the medical examiner. Now, he's a politically appointed person. He's not a doctor. He says after the trial, I suspected her for a long time, but I didn't want to make her mad. I didn't want to, you can't unring that bell, I believe was a direct quote. Why wasn't he charged afterwards is what I don't understand. Because he admitted that he knew that this was going on. And we had she was even buying rat poison in Pacific on a specific schedule.
Right.
That it's a lot of rats, as we said. It's a whole lot of rats. And he didn't autopsy them because he wasn't a doctor. So he was just writing off based on their, Eugene or Bertha's, advice. It took Brinley's ex-wife to stop it and say this needs to, she also, her stories changed. She couldn't handle the whole going to trial stuff. The one thing that I found really interesting about her is that she got her hair done before the trial, and she got this saucy little 1920s do with the cute little hat. And she was in her 50s, again, kind of matronly, but not for court. The other thing that we didn't talk about with Emma and Bertha is that they didn't have female sheriffs or any law enforcement. So oftentimes the sheriff's wife would be guarding the women.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's another women's history thing is why didn't they have people, a facility? And Emma went into the first female facility that wasn't an incarceration, an insane asylum.
Yeah.
Out at Bryn's Farm, which is outside of Jeff City. They didn't even have a facility for women crime because it didn't happen, they said. So it all goes back to that, who won the the medical history is told by, the men in the medical field. Why did childbirth change? That from having a midwife that understood the it was money, and he was a politician, the medical examiner was. So I think that kind of ties it in.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that you said. It's also just like the psychology of women are like oftentimes been misunderstood, and the whole women could never hurt a child.
Right.
Even throughout all of history, there's never really such clear evidence towards women. They're usually just little gossip here and there,
Yeah.
or people whispering. And it was really interesting to read about Bertha's case, where people started talking enough for it to become an actual case against her.
Yeah, but it took a long time. There also, poison's not a smoking gun. Although in Bertha's case, to me, it was as close as it could get.
Right.
Child went in with pneumonia. Child leaves with arsenic in system and dies of gastritis. Fred Brindley comes in, not Fred, but Brindley comes in. Mm-hmm. He's drunk. He dies. He has gastritis. And so you have to, somewhere, and the medical examiner did make that connection. But again, whether he was afraid of her burning down his, there were so many rumors about her yelling at people, kicking them off her property, the anger, and and that is also a sign of the psychosis that she had.
Do you know what happened to the medical examiner after trial? Do you know if he kept that position? He
did keep the position, but he didn't run for it again afterwards. It was up shortly after all this blew up, and he was contrite, but he still didn't get arrested for contributing, or I don't know what all he could have been arrested on, but he was never held accountable.
Yeah. And you kind of already answered this question, with everything else, but why do you think it took so much out of people for them to say, this is something suspicious is going on here, this needs to be brought to the attention of authorities? Both of these cases, they were caught pretty late in their
career, so to speak. You hear that all the time with serial killers, the neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
There was a case on the border of Kansas and Missouri. He lived in Missouri. He was killing on both sides. He was on the internet in a weird, we won't go into what kind of group he was with, but he would then attract women down. He had a wife that was living at this house. He had a storage facility over here.
Mm-hmm.
The wife was weed eating around his barrels that he had corpses in. No idea. I think that the psychology, and especially if you look at the small town psychology, is that it can't happen here. And you see that all the time with, he was so quiet, he used to mow my lawn. That's the whole point, is that they can pass in society, or they leave society because they can't pass in society and kill. So you have to wait until someone gets pushed too far. you know, and you can see it over and over again. Like, you know, Jeffrey Dahmer, somebody escaped from his house 4 times, but he was a white male in a black neighborhood. And these kids were problem kids because they were on drugs or they were prostitutes or whatever. And it took one with the loudest mouth, the most complaints, to get out there. But they even ignored the neighbors when the neighbors are like, you know, there is something wrong here. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, oh, crazy old Ms. Brendley, you know, he was always drunk. Why wouldn't he be drunk now? She's like, I don't even like him. He's my ex. You know, but there's something going on here. And another really interesting thing about Bertha's, they're all in a small community. They're buried all over the county. They're not all buried in a city cemetery or a county cemetery. And I don't know if that had anything to do with how she was killing, but the cemetery that her husband was in and that she ends up being in, there are like 3 or 4 victims in there. Her husband, the stepson, one of the baby Beulahs, 2 more. There are 5 in that cemetery with her. And they buried her right next to her ex-husband. I mean, her first husband. It's like, oh, that's not nice. But you know, and then she was unmarked. But that whole you just can't see evil in your backyard type of thing, I think it's true. And in the 40s and 50s with Emma, you know, you had that whole post-World War II, you know, democracy in, you know, yay, the United States, and you didn't want to break that. So that's where I think it's going. Mm-hmm. Someday I'll find a psychologist that'll look at it for me, but...
As well, you kind of already answered this question,
okay.
But why do you think it was important to mention the people, like the heroes of both stories, like the ones that were more loud, about how suspicious Emma and Bertha were?
It's part of the story. You know, you have to tell the story, and you have to tell the aspects of the story. And basically, both of them could have start over. Both of them could have kept on killing, except for the family that step up and stop it, or the neighbor that, you know, is suspicious and has the smell and reports the smell all the time. But you'll notice that it took the boys, the Schemmel boys, whose father was still alive. It was primarily white males who were the heroes, but they weren't the real heroes, because Lucretia was a woman, and, you know, the daughter, Isabel, saved her sister from being poisoned by Emma. They still didn't listen to her, even though you can see the picture, and the picture's here. That's one of the pictures I got from the Historical Society here, of the child was skeletal. So, you know, how you have to get somebody to believe in you. That's how it works. And honestly, the people that got believed were, you know, white men in a farming community, and maybe that's the not that I don't love white men, you know, I love history, but you have to tell the story. That's how they got stopped. And, you know, why did they choose their victims? I can tell you why they chose their victims, you know, because they didn't have family, or they were sick and they knew the babies were sick. And yeah, Bertha's, this is a side note, Bertha's victims ranged from, I think it was 8 months to 72 years. You know, so she didn't even have like an MO. The MO, we think, was that they offended her at some point. You know, so that the only way to get it with a non-smoking gun is somebody has to make noise and get the police to believe you. Steve Hepperman. He was great.
So, both Emma and Bertha were convicted of their crimes.
Yes.
Some of them, at least.
Yes.
But neither of them were given the death penalty. Why do you think that was? Do you think it was because of their, like, age, gender, or do you think it was more because they were considered criminally insane?
Emma was never considered criminally insane. Emma was, in their opinion, a cold-blooded, calculating, premeditated killer. But to be that, do you have to be sane? It was because they didn't kill women at that point. They just didn't put them on death row. It didn't matter. But you remember they were all kind of matronly, kind of like your grandma, even though I think Emma was like in her 50s. And she looks like she's in her 70s with the little pearls, and the whole thing. I think that they understood that public sentiment would go against them if they executed women at this point. And I'm sure there's a couple of women that they did. I know there was one in Arizona and they stopped. It went badly. But they stopped using hanging at that point because of that. But then another woman didn't get executed for a very long time. So my guess is Missouri just didn't want to be responsible for that. And Bertha was criminally ill and went to the stricter of the institutions. But according to the community, she was very pretty. I'm not sure I agree, but she was okay.
It's funny that you mentioned like Emma was considered like the more like calculated like killer, but yet she was the one that was released. Like obviously, Bertha had her mental illnesses, but Emma was considered not endangered to society.
Well, and that she got released as part of a program that was like getting rid of the population of those. I also think that they knew she had cancer and she didn't have long to live, so she wouldn't have enough time to cultivate another husband and take him. And I think that's why they moved her to Kirksville, because then she'd have to start completely from scratch, type of thing. So get her out of sight, out of mind. I was surprised they brought her back and buried her here, but it was because she was still part of the state system. So, yeah. I don't know why they released her other than she was on her deathbed, but she lasted 3 months. Could have gotten a date.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really high note to end on discussion. Is there anything else that you want to bring up regarding those two cases specifically?
We got a lot of flack for putting some of the later cases in, that were other Missouri cases that it was only... And the reason we did that is because, honestly, the publisher needed some filler, because it's really hard to get enough information on people that's not circumstantial. And almost everything we got on these women was circumstantial. And we can take that, view of, it looks so obvious to us in hindsight, but Emma didn't kill someone in the same town ever, other than St. Louis. So it's so, how do you connect that? I called Steelville and I said, you had a serial killer, and they're like, no, we didn't. And I'm like, no, you did. And I think she killed 3 people that were of her family in Steelville. Now, Steelville had a axe murderer. They accept him as part of their history, but not Emma. And I think that's some of what I want people to consider when they're looking at women's history is, why is it different from men's history? We have the running joke in the history community that people say, well, why don't we have man's history? It's like, well, we've been writing man's history for 200 years in the United States. Let's spread out a little bit, But the perspectives are all different. And right now, thank goodness, we're at a phase where we can get a lot more done. And it may go back down. It goes like this, But women did things. And good things and bad things, and it's really nice to get some of their names out. And it shouldn't have to take like a movie to do it. You know, like there was a woman that worked for NASA on the Manhattan Project. She was out of Kansas City. One of the hidden figures was from Kansas City. I've never seen a memorial or anything, you know, for her. That would be cool. And then a side note, Jack the Ripper had his 5 victims in London. None of those women are marked. Like there's not even a little panel that said, number 4 died right here. Why? By the way, there's a book called 5. It's on Jack the Ripper's 5 women. They pretty much proved that they weren't all prostitutes. So again, we have people writing, you know, go back to the red journalism. You have to weigh all of your options. So you have to take your oral history, you have to take your artifacts, you have to take your, you know, newspapers, and then try to tell a story that may or may not be complete, because there's so many spokes coming off of any story like these guys. I ran out of spokes, so we had to fill with some other ones, and we came up with some good ones. Honestly, I will tell you, I don't think I'll ever do one that is this current in history. It was too current for me. I didn't like the fact that people were still living this. That they had, like, some of the victims' families were still alive, are still alive. Came and introduced themselves to me, and that was one thing that made me feel better, was that their family got some justice being told their story. Like Mr. Hepperman. You know, he was a prominent member of society in O'Fallon, and they had lots of land, and he was a nice, incredible guy, and he got snuffed out by a maniac, basically. Although, you know, don't answer want ads. That's what I can tell you. But, again, these stories needed to be told, and that's one of the reasons why we did it. And we have to acknowledge that there's pieces of history that are missing. So, another high horse I'll get on.
No, and I completely agree with like everything you said, and I also think it's important to point out how you wrote this book, like paying attention to the history of both Emma and Bertha, but you also really paid attention to the victims and told whatever you could of their story, and I think that was very important. I feel like what is more common, because it's easier to do whenever discussing like serial killers, is to mainly focus on the killer, yes, right. But then you miss everyone else that was affected by them.
Yeah. Funny enough, I watch an incredible amount of true crime. We watch a lot of Criminal Minds and the TV show, and they were so far ahead, historically speaking, in my opinion, because that's what they talk about. They're like, you know, so-and-so, 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 and they're like, I don't know who that is. It's like, that was the victims of the people that did that. You know, the Dahmer story that they just did 2 documentaries on. People were very angry that they were telling the story from his perspective at first. And if you didn't watch it, it's amazing, but it's really brutal. Right. But by the end of it, they have flipped it around and acknowledged every single victim. And you get that a lot more now. It wasn't in vogue, but yeah, people know all the killers. But not Bundy, Gacy. They just identified another one of his victims 2 years ago. You know, and they still have 3, I think it is, that they haven't been able to identify. Well, we were able to pull these, at least by the genealogy, going through their death certificates, and where we can put everybody in time and place, and see that there were more people dying than like the 7, you know, the 4 of her husbands. That, you know, someone's mother died because she was in the way, and it's so important to tell everybody a story.
Yeah, that's what I really liked about like Emma's like section of the book. It's you really don't focus on like Emma this year. You're like husband one, this is his name. Husband two, this is his name. You
Yeah.
get these relatives that were affected by Emma actions.
We did that very deliberately. Yeah. With Bertha, they were coming too quick.
Yeah.
They couldn't. We couldn't get. It had to be on a timeline
Uh-huh.
for Bertha, because it was just like one after another. We were a little appalled at the end when we're sitting looking and we're like, do we write this or not? Because this is a lot of people that died. Story needs to be told, but how upsetting is this going to be to the entire town of Catawissa that we're talking about, that she killed other people? I know Kay was furious with us, her granddaughter, and I'm like, I don't blame her. It's her grandma. She won't speak to me, but I wish that she knew that her book was incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great step in the right direction of looking at that women's history, that why she didn't get a fair trial.
Mm-hmm.
She had to be crazy,
Right.
type of thing. So it was a great journey. It really was. Like I said, I'm not sure I want to do it as current. I think I'll stick to the 19th century, but it had to be told. And I was mad at the publisher. You can cut this part out. Do those look like matrons to you?
Not necessarily.
No, those are like silhouettes of people in their 20s. And we're like, we want matrons, because that's the whole point, is that these women were matronly, and that meant that they were trustable.
Mm-hmm.
They were caretakers.
Right.
I lost, but that's okay. It's all about presentation.
Exactly. Are you still like doing research, not specifically about like these two cases, but like, are you working on something new?
Yes. We're always looking for something new, always. And generally it takes about 2 years to write from me getting obsessed to publication. We had COVID. A lot of things went bad during that whole 5-year period. And so at work, I wrote a booklet, because the bicentennial, Missouri's bicentennial happened in 21, of 200 African American Missourians who changed the state. I haven't gotten it published yet through the state. It's on its last journey, because writing biographies for 200 people was probably a little too much, but incredible people. And so that's what I was working on. So when you're talking about, do I still do genealogy work? Do I still do? Yes, constantly. Because you never know where the next story is going to come back. And, I found out about Madame LaLaurie because I went on a ghost tour. I found out about McDowell because I went on a ghost tour. I found out about her, about Hepperman, because someone came in and asked me at a historic site. And you just never know where that spark's going to lead. And so I'm constantly, I have several hundred trees on Ancestry right now. So, and I do look, some of them I think needed some attention, some more attention, like Bremser. And I try to do some research to see if we can't find some closure for him. He's just sitting there, lost and found, literally.
I think at some point they just disregard.
Well, they have to.
Right.
I mean, it's legally binding. There's nothing they can do, and we marked a grave of a ragtime player. I used to work out at the Scott Joplin House, and we had to get a sign-off from their family to mark his grave. So, what if you can't find, like Bremser? Bresmer. We weren't able to find anyone that could say, yeah, you guys can go ahead and put him, in a mausoleum somewhere. But, so I go back in every once in a while. And then I found my Emma stuff that I needed. That was good for me. 'Cause I hate not finding things.
Well, at least you figured out the mystery of Frank Lee. So.
I didn't.
But it was brought to you.
Yeah, that was actually really funny because it was the Washington Library, now that I think of it, and they're like, "Can I show you something?" And I'm like, "Sure." And they laid it out, and I'm like, "That's Frank Lee." And they're like, "Yeah." And it was like cartoons of the killers. I don't know if you've ever seen them. They were basically like folios that have the story of these horrible, people and women, and some of them are cartoons and some of them are actual pictures, and I'm like, and they're like, "That's my great uncle. I found this in my house." And I'm like, "This is incredible." So yeah, we like that.
Yeah, those are all the questions that I had typed up.
Okay, we're going to do the shameful plug. You can buy these at several of the Walgreens around town because it was specific to St. Charles County. Barnes & Noble carries them, and of course they're online. And that's all of our books are like that. They're all Missouri-based at this point. The one out of New Orleans, we cracked the mystery of where she went after an incident that brought the whole thing to life. Mm-hmm. Here, in Skinker, at the Missouri History Museum, we found out where she went because her lawyer's collection was there. Love historical societies. Love historical societies. So helpful.
Yeah, if you want to say a little louder, you love St. Charles Historical Society.
I love the St. Charles Historical Society. They had the best stuff on Emma that no one else had. It was great. And that they have a person doing oral histories and interviews. Super cool.
Really?
Yes, it is. Because you don't get someone's story if you don't have someone who can do it. So.
Do you have anything you want?
Did I miss anything?
I'd just like to say thank you.
Oh, thank you. One of my best quotes that I loved. We didn't talk about it as much. Aloysius's brother, Alon's, on the witness stand, said, she threatened to kill me 2 or 3 times, but lucky thing I didn't eat her potato soup. Like, you can't write fiction like that.
I also thought it was such a great detail that you added, like, the biscuits and, like, the soup recipe, like, on the back. You're like, this isn't theirs, but...
Close enough. The Heppermans have a diary with Emma's potato soup in it. I don't know if all the Heppermans know that, but somebody showed me her actual, and I was like, and it was after the publication, right. And they didn't want to get in trouble, but with their family members. But yeah, it was, why are they so good? That you can't taste arsenic in it because it's kind of nasty. Yeah. Rat poison.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
No, thank you guys.